I'm here in front of the Department of East Asian Languages and Civilizations, and you'll notice right here is a piece of calligraphy by Rao Zongyi. Rao Zongyi is probably the greatest living calligrapher of China. And he writes here, 四文在此, which simply says something like this culture of ours resides here. But what he's referring to is a passage from the Analects of Confucius. And Confucius was one day trapped between two states, and he was under threat. His disciples all very worried, and Confucius says, 文王寂寞，文不在此乎? King Wen, the founder of the Zhou dynasty, is long gone, but is not his culture here with me? And he's looking to heaven and saying, heaven protects me. Heaven protects me to make it possible for people born after me to participate in this culture. So Rao Zongyi, in doing this calligraphy, is saying, even today, to participate in this culture in a foreign country, in a foreign place, this is something that matters. We're going to go downstairs now to the Harvard Yangzheng Library and talk a bit more about Confucius. But on the way, I want to show you another piece of calligraphy, this one from the 17th century. This was done by the famous calligrapher Dong Qichang from the late Ming Dynasty. Great artist, great calligrapher, a theorist of the arts as well. But what he's writing with his calligraphy is not something that he himself wrote. He's actually copying something that somebody in the 11th century wrote, a man named Zhou Deni. And Zhou Deni begins by saying, 生可说乎? 曰可. Can you learn how to be a sage? And the answer is yes. Well, when they're talking about a sage, they're talking about Confucius. Confucius not as somebody with innate gifts, but somebody who is a model that we can learn from, and we can learn to be sages just like Confucius. And so there, from Rao Zongyi in the 21st century, back to Confucius in the 6th century BC, to the 11th century, to the 16th century, Confucius has remained a figure in Chinese history. And trying to understand why and what he was saying and what he meant is our job for today. Confucius defines the problem of his day, and he defines it in a very simple way. He says, we have lost the way. We've lost the way. If there's a path, somebody must have walked it before you. You know that it has to go somewhere. It has a destination. And you know if you're on it or not. And Confucius' way of saying we've lost the way is to say we are not on the right path. And so his job is to say what that path is, how to be on the right path. There's a larger problem here, perhaps, that a contrast with the Western tradition or the Mediterranean tradition. Or Plato, who keeps saying that the ideas, the forms that we represent in the world can never really be equal to the real and true form. In the Western tradition, there is necessarily going to be a gap between is and ought, and we will not recover. After Adam and Eve bit the apple, people fell in the Judeo-Christian tradition and can never fully recover. But for Confucius, he granted that there was a gap between how we ought to be and how we are. We're not on the path, and we should be on the path. But he was convinced that we could get back to the right place, that there did not need to be any gap between is and ought. That at a certain moment, we could act spontaneously and do what was right, that we could be entirely on the right path. He says at one point, I was 15 when I set my will on learning, and then he says, at 70, I could follow my desires without overstepping the bounds. I could live this spontaneous, real life, and yet a proper and moral life. If Confucius says, I know the problem, but I can solve it. We're not on the way, but I know what the way is. How does he know what the way is? And I'm not going to answer that question, because I don't think Confucius really can answer the question how I know what the way is, but what he can answer is where I know the way from. He's saying there's a source from which we can know how we have to be today. And what's the source? The source is antiquity, his antiquity. Confucius is one of the first people to say the answers lie in antiquity, even though for Confucius, antiquity was 500 years before the founding of the Zhou dynasty. They knew something then. They were doing something then that guaranteed that they would be on the right path. Confucius says, "Haogu mini chojer," I like antiquity and I am good at seeking it. He says at another point, he says, "Shuar buzol," I transmit, I do not innovate. Confucius is convinced that he is taking something that was real, that was in the past, and bringing it into the present and pointing us our direction to it. And what is it? And here, I'm going to give you the answer that Confucius has, and you're not going to find it very exciting. Well, his answer is that it's ritual. Not very exciting, the Chinese word li. And he means rituals very much in the sense of rituals. For example, a ceremony, a marriage ceremony, right? Where people have roles, they practice, they learn the roles, and by carrying out the ritual, they actually change the situation. They now become married to each other. Or think of a larger ceremony, a church service, or a commencement at a university. Think of ceremonies as occasions where people have many different roles to play. And each person learns their proper role and carries it out in harmony with others. And thus, together, they make something happen. They complete something. That's ritual. Now extend that concept of ritual to daily life. Think of it in terms of your relationship with your parents, with your siblings, with your colleagues, with your friends. Think of that as an occasion where we have roles to play and the other party has roles to play. And that ritual enactment, all through our lives, those rituals of daily practice are in fact what keeps us together as people and keeps us, so to speak, out of harm's way in our relationships with others. So Confucius at one point takes up this issue of ritual and applies it. He applies it to government. He said, well, somebody asks him, what's the key to good government? He says, no problem at all. He says, let the ruler act as a ruler should act. The father act as a father should act. The son act as a son should act, and so on. That's all it takes to have a good society. Let people play their roles, even though he could recognize that perhaps they weren't playing those roles in the present. I told you that in this Korean text, the glosses on the classics, there is a phrase about 8 dancers. This actually comes from a passage in the Analects where Confucius is talking about one of the noble families of his own state, the Ji family. And he says, the Ji family uses 8 rows of dancers in the courtyard. If this can be tolerated, what cannot be tolerated? Well, you would know, I guess if you lived at those times, that 8 rows of dancers in the courtyard was a prerogative reserved for the Lord, not for any old noble family. And he was using ritual, the ritual of a performance, to usurp the authority of somebody higher than him, or the Ji family was doing this. It was their way of encroaching on the authority of their superiors, which means that ritual can be used hypocritically. You can use ritual to seek advantage. You can use ritual, in fact, to go against the very purposes of ritual itself. And Confucius was aware of this problem, that ritual had become meaningless for many. And if you can't figure out how to make it meaningful again, if you can't figure out how to get a ruler to act as a ruler should act, a subject to act as a subject should act, if you can't do that, then there's no hope for getting back on the right way. And this is the moment at which I think we see Confucius, the philosopher Confucius, the first great thinker, moral thinker in Chinese history, emerge, because he accepts that fact. And rather than going in the direction that some of his contemporaries did, which is to say, well, why don't we take rituals and define them as laws and demand that everybody follow these laws or they will be punished. And that way we could have a good society. Confucius says, no, that's not the solution. And what he comes up with is the notion that we have to bring an attitude towards ritual. He begins to focus on an attitude, and he has a name for it. He calls it Ren. And he says to his disciples, if you want to be Ren, you can be Ren just like that. You can't do ritual without Ren. You can't make music work without Ren. You have to have this attitude of Ren. But his disciples get very confused. They keep trying to pin him down, to try to get him to define Ren as a particular idea or set of words you could say, or a particular set of actions, ways to behave. And Confucius keeps pulling back. He says, no, Ren is something different. Ren is something different. And what is it? There's a passage in the Analects, and you can see it here. It's called the method of Ren, the method of what we might call benevolence, humaneness. Actually, any English translation isn't going to be fully adequate, but humaneness, benevolence, these work well enough. Confucius asked, how about somebody who could come in and, and save the world, and make sure that all the starving were fed, and bring peace to the world? How about that? He said, wow, as Confucius says, that would be even hard for Yao and Shun, the great sage kings of antiquity. It'd be hard for them. But that's not Ren. That's not Ren. So what's Ren? He said, well, the method of Ren is to want others to advance to the degree that you advance yourself. In other words, it's not about self-sacrifice. It's about the ability to look at the other and see in the other your own interests as well, and want to advance their interests as you advance your own, to see yourself as part of a community where you're helping yourself move forward involves helping others move forward as well. So what Confucius seems to be saying is that to be a person of Ren is to bring to bear on your performance of your duties, of your activities, of your rituals, an attitude of concern for the others. A very simple thing. But if you think about it, that was in some sense the essence of ritual in the first place. That we are acting in harmony together, in response to each other. And Confucius is saying that's the attitude that consciously you must have in you and bring to your performance of life itself.